what is technology? It's either a means to an end, or it's a mode of human activity. So it's either instrumental, it's anthropomorphic.
It's a tool or a device.
Yes. I would say no, it's not. What it is, it's a mode of revealing. He'd say aletheia, so the Greek word for uncovering, bringing into being. So, because obviously Heidegger saw everything as beings. But what he says is essentially the modern mode of being is all about calculation and pinning things down to their essences. And what this basically fosters is a view of we can itemize the entire planet, the entirety of being, even down to the individual person. And, we essentially estrange ourselves from authentic in the world being into a kind of he calls it Vorhandenheit, so into this sort of theoretical phase space where everything becomes, as you say, standard reserve. So what this is characterized by is one, ismos, so the doctrinalization of everything. This is why I don't like the word environmentalism in the first place, because it posits a system where there's not a system, and it forgets these old pre-modern ideals of stewardship and sort of holistic, poetic existence in the world.
Their attitudes and obligations instead.
Yeah. So, it's how do we offload this sort of calculative mindset and return to something a bit more conducive,
C.S. Lewis was talking about that towards the end of the Abolition of Man, and he was saying we need a almost new natural science, something akin to what Thomas Aquinas was talking about, of where you understand the essence of the thing and respect it rather than trying to master it. It really is the stewardship versus dominion argument. And I was talking to Abigail Favale about this. She gave me a great insight into Genesis, and she said the fascinating thing about language, logos specifically, is that human logos is very different to divine logos, because logos speaks the world into being in John and Genesis, whereas human logos recognizes the essence of being and speaks to its truth. So when an animal is presented to Adam, again, it can be allegory, guys, for the atheists sat to my right and in the audience. When he sees an animal, he names it instantly, and the name fits. So that means he is speaking to the truth of an eternal essence of what was being created, rather than just imposing his will on the world. And that's the kind of natural science that would be better, where we observe and we don't extrapolate and make standing reserve. We live correlative to it. We have respect for it.
I think that's a good analogy, although in many ways I think it's strange that we feel the need to name stuff. I know that sounds weird and silly. Like it's practical from a human perspective, but it's kind of a form of anthropomorphizing in a sense. This is kind of just struck me now, in that it's how it relates to our perspective. But to use the example of the background, a squirrel doesn't know it's called a squirrel.
It just knows predator or prey or in-group.
Yeah, and so it is a sort of an imposition on nature in a sort of metaphysical sense.
This is the issue with essentialism, making essences out of things, because 500 years ago they were saying, a bit longer, the mass populace would have looked at a squirrel and think it's a squirrel. They wouldn't think, it's this kind of, I was about to say marsupial, it's this kind of it belongs to this family and genus and blah blah blah, and there would have been sort of myths and folk tales attached to these things, which would have created the sentimentality, rather than you coming into it with a microscope and saying, this is what a squirrel is, this is why we need to sort of conserve it. So it's a difference of abstract, as opposed to abstraction via essentialism. It's more about interconnectivity between everything.
It's like the Iroquois would have had more respect for the blue jay that is currently now stuffed and behind glass in the museum by the creation myth they had for it, not just learning its Latin name.
Exactly.
I like that.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk about something that isn't necessarily that controversial, I don't think, and that is of animal conservation. And of course, this is something that's done by both charities, sometimes governments, and sometimes hunters as well. And I wanted to have a little explore of that, before then talking about conservation more generally. And I actually found some good quotes from Theodore Roosevelt, who I'm not a fan of, but he's right on this one instance. He says, "In a civilized and cultivated country, wild animals only continue to exist at all when preserved by sportsmen. The excellent people who protest against all hunting and consider sportsmen as enemies of wildlife are ignorant of the fact that in reality, the genuine sportsman is by all odds the most important factor in keeping larger and more valuable wild creatures from total extermination." And this is kind of building on something that is, I think, innate to humans. You look at some of the earliest human societies and they're sort of animistic in a sense. They also worship animals. You see this in many depictions of early art. They're depicting animals, aren't they?
The golden calf idol in the Bible, good example.
And so people recognize the importance of the natural world. And I think the people who recognize its importance are those who rely on it the most. And in our detachment from the world, I don't think we necessarily realize quite how important it is to preserve these species. And I think some people may even say, I support conservation in theory and practice, but haven't necessarily thought about it to the degree in which it informs the world around them and their view of nature and the view of themselves as well, actually. I think it's one of those things whereby if an animal species does go extinct, I think it's a tragedy that far surpasses, destruction of a priceless artwork. It's a tragedy in the utmost terms, in my opinion.
He's correct. He's not. I don't think he's criticizing civilization.
No, I don't think so.
But this is a symptom of civilization where basically, this is what Strauss would say. It's you start to view. So he's talking about large herbivores or beasts or whatever that you go and hunt. He's viewing these as means of acquiring glory, right? Rather than and that's the incentive to keep them around, right? Yes. Rather than actual beings that are worth value in themselves.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, this
is very like Hobbesian sort of view on it.
No, you're right. It's what is our proximity to nature? Does it exist at our behest? And this is the great irony of modernity, is that African nature reserves that allow you to hunt things like Cecil the lion that caused outrage years ago save far more animals than Peter does, because Peter puts down more dogs than it saves. This is also something that's like a source of torment. There was a friend of mine brought to my attention a little while ago the poetry of a forgotten romantic called John Clare, and he is largely forgotten from the romantic tradition because he was a counter-romantic coming from the romantic tradition, of where he was observing the natural countryside, and it was shortly after the enclosure of the commons, where land was taken away from the crown and given to landowners just before the Industrial Revolution, which was it set the legal stage to move into cities and flood them. And he was looking at the slow extinction of the countryside by industrialization, and he was writing about it in such emotive, beautiful terms that he actually went mad. He spent the rest of his life in an insane asylum writing parodies of Lord Byron and just died. And that's why he's precluded when you've got the great poetry of John Keats observing nature, and of William Blake observing the squalid conditions of London. But that's the dichotomy in the Romantic movement. It's we've mastered this area, now we have to observe the area that we haven't mastered. Clare was actually pointing at the point of we've become disintegrated, and that's what's driving us mad collectively. And that's why you've got this weird paradox now of the nature reserves, where you can hunt the animals, saving them more than the people that say they purport to save them, where they're just putting them down for efficiency, managerial reasons.
No, that's very, very true. I've also got Jack, our editor, to edit in some endangered animals behind us, and I think that actually being quite aware of the endangered animals in your country is a very noble thing, because things like the red squirrel here, they have basically been wiped out by the grey squirrel. We don't really get that many hares anymore because the rabbit, which came across from the continent, I think it was the Normans that introduced it.
Romans.
It was the Romans, was it? Has pretty much outcompeted our native wildlife. And you might say, well, competition's fair. The rabbit won over the hare. But at the same time, a lot of the other animals aren't set to live with these these new invasive species, and so it has a negative impact on the other species as well, because they existed together and are all interdependent on one another. And if we introduce these new species or old species become removed, the strength of the entire ecosystem suffers from it. And I think that's something that we're never going to be able to recover from. There is no recovery from it. If an animal goes extinct from an ecosystem, it will never be as bountiful as it once was, if that's a noble aim in and of itself.
Thank you for watching that clip from my series Contemplations. If you want to sign up to the website for £5 a month, you can access that series, which comes out 1 p.m. every Saturday. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.